I want to start by saying big thank you for organizing these workshops. I want to go on the record and say what a great service you're doing to the field and to the profession in doing these, bringing all these people here together. I hope you do it for many, many years and decades to come. My talk is on pro-environmental behavior, subjective well-being in public policies. And before I go into that, I want to reflect a little bit on identity, because I've also been working a lot of identity and how identity, how we see ourselves shapes our perceptions of the world and also our subjective well-being. For me, I've never seen myself as an environmental economist. So when Francesco said, can't you do a talk about the environment, sustainability, and how it's relevant for well-being and for policymaking, I thought, that's weird. Why should I give a talk on that? And then I thought, oh my God, I published a couple of papers on that. I could actually do that. But since I don't see myself as an environmental economist or somebody who's deeply in the sustainability debates, I also can, for a lecture like that, maybe take the 30,000 feet view from above and talk a little bit about how I perceive the field. I don't have a big stake in there. I don't have big value commitments in there. And maybe it helps to see what's going well and what's going not well in this. Before I go into it, I also want to mention, and I want to give a big shout out to Ann-Kathrin Blankenberg, because she co-authored most of the papers with me. She's a professor of economics in Berlin. She's the environmental economist in the team. Don't blame her for any deficiencies. Those are likely due to me. But anything that's great for the environment in our work, that's coming from her. Okay. Sustainability. I'm not going to motivate that it is for most people an issue and most people see it as important. I think that's something I just want to assume here. Maybe the one thing I'm going to say, this is fun fact from Berlin. Young people these days in Berlin are so ticked off with people my age for not doing enough for the environment that they actually started gluing themselves on our nice streets there. There's a lot of publicity on this. It's a little bit like Extinction Rebellion in German. Germans love their Autobahns, so this is how they really get us. Emotions are going high. There's a lot of pressure and a lot of this feeling we need to finally come to grips with climate change and do something. I'm going to talk a little bit today about this idea. If we're assuming we want to institute sustainability policies, if we're assuming we want to do something about climate change, reaching sustainability, what can subjective well-being studies, what can happiness research, I'll prefer that term because it's a little bit easier to say, what role can they play? Okay, so it's going to be a talk about the specific focus about subjective well-being for policies. What role can happiness research play there? And I'm going to narrow it down a little bit more as well. I'll focus mostly later on this idea of a double dividend. So the idea that if we're doing green things, that's going to benefit our subjective well-being and it's going to benefit the environment. So why aren't we doing more of that? Okay. I'll also specifically focus on challenges in making these things credible. Okay? If we want to institute policy based on that knowledge, what are we there yet? What can we do? What do we not know yet? And don't get me as economists breaking down on the internet and starting to rant about the field, everything is bad. See it more as so many bright people here, so many people here who are using strong techniques, who are very interested in that. What could you do? What could we do as a field to do it better, to make our policy advice more credible? Fine print on this. I'm not going to claim or to argue at any point that climate change and sustainability are issues that are primarily tackled by happiness research, okay? Climate change is a global coordination problem, externality, public good problem, whatnot. Lots of other policies will be relevant in dealing with that. I'm very modest here in saying, could we be part of that? And in what sense could we be part of that? Okay, so I'm very, very briefly summing up what I think we know about the environment and subjective well-being. Then I'm going through the promise part of the talk. I'm going to sketch 3 proposals. There might be many more. There might be even some I'm not aware of, but I've chosen 3 today. I'm starting with grand proposals, and then I'm going back and narrowing it down to more modest proposals. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the pitfalls associated with that. I've chosen really to call it not problems in that sense, but it's stuff we don't know yet, and that's okay to don't know that stuff yet. For me, that's always a motivation. If I don't know something yet, I want to find out, and I'm assuming most of you are similar. So here's, I think in that part of the talk, there's a lot of opportunity to write good papers, right? That's what I'm trying to convince you of. And I think for the environment, for all of our sakes, if you would be doing that, good way of spending your time. Okay, what do we know? The environment and subjective well-being. A lot of research. I don't know whether Finmar Brereton is still in the audience, was here yesterday, about positive effects of parks, coastlines, green features of the environment, blue features of the environment, all sorts of things. We know that positively contributes, or is positively at least associated with all sorts of well-being. Huge literature here. Similarly, big literature also on pollution, noise pollution, environmental pollution, partly very, very good and very, very strong papers using natural experiments, using strong identification strategies to actually link stuff such as airport noise, SO2 levels, CO2 levels to negative effects on well-being in countries. I'm thinking all the time of Simon Lüchinger's work here, but there's other papers, other strong papers as well. Similarly, we know climate change, including catastrophes like Fukushima or droughts, other things, also negatively influence our subjective well-being. Lots of work there where we can actually say, okay, we know a lot how the environment is actually associated with our subjective well-being. If you're interested in reading a bit more on that, the World Happiness Report in 2020 has a chapter on that. And that might be an interesting point to start you off. In my talk, I'm more interested in pro-environmental attitudes and behavior and subjective well-being. That's what I want to focus on later on. This is why I put that on an extra slide. We know that for the most part in most papers, if you're a person that's environmentally concerned, you have higher well-being. If you subscribe strongly to biospheric values, that goes back to Schwartz's value scale, then that's associated with higher well-being. Similar green self-image. So this is identity. This is something I've been doing research on. If you say my life is generally one which I'm living green, that is positively associated with your subjective well-being. So those are the attitudes. We have a similar literature on pro-environmental behaviors and subjective well-being. I'm going to criticize that later on a lot, but I just want to say there are a lot of studies there that link, for instance, the intention to buy green to higher well-being. Other studies, and this is one of the things, they mostly focus on behavioral reports. So they are self-reports of what did you do? Do I leave the tap water running? Yes, no. We have sustainable food consumption. This is a fun study. Buddhist fellowship members who actually had more sustainable food consumption habits were more satisfied with their lives. And you have a wide variety of other papers linking recycling, resource conservation, other environmental behaviors to positive, effective, and or cognitive well-being outcomes. This is a recent meta-analysis summarizing all that. So some of the studies I've chosen were a little bit handpicked by me for various reasons. But if you go through all of them, this is what you see. Savetsky et al. Looked at 78 of those studies, and the relationship between pro-environmental behavior and subjective well-being correlates at the order of 0.243. It depends a little bit on the type of behavior that you're having. So the correlation is stronger for purchasing behavior. It's weaker for collective action, waste behavior. And it also varies a little bit with the concept you're looking at. If you're wondering what the difference between hedonic happiness and warm glow is, I was a little surprised by that myself. I wasn't aware you can make that distinction. This is general emotions, and warm glow happiness, they measured that in the sense that a direct result of an action gives me that warm glow. I found that a little bit idiosyncratic, but I thought I should comment because that's the one that produces the largest coefficient in this meta-analysis. So that's what we know in a nutshell, in the nuttest of nutshells. What can we do with it? Right? What sort of public policies could be interesting? And it is as if I had known that we're on a workshop measuring social progress. So I'm going to start with that. The most radical, if you ask me, proposal is, well, we could use that knowledge to actually think about somehow redefine our notion of what it means for societies to progress. Right? What is progress? We can define that differently. And this is nothing, right now I'm not speaking from the point of view of subjective well-being studies. This is not new. So my partner, the minister, yesterday asked the question, what can I use as measure instead of GDP? Well, Cobb Daly and others from the 1980s would like to call and say, we have the general progress indicator. That's a one figure measure. And it's just like GDP, but it takes into account the environment. So this is, for some reason, it didn't get really picked up, but it exists in the environmentalist area. And there's many more of these indicators. I looked into that. We're having, so from the Index of Sustainable Welfare, we went to the general, no, it's not genuine, it's genuine progress indicator. There's a genuine progress indicator 2.0, lots of other things. What's the specific contribution of happiness research to this part of the literature? Well, obviously, that's also not extremely new, but I think it is in some sense extremely radical. This is Dina Seligman's economy of well-being. Go away and make well-being central, but put a focus on the environment. Okay, I'm reading, sorry, Carrie, if I'm putting words in your mouth, but when the OECD started with the House Life Initiative, I know it's a dashboard, but I personally always read it in some sense because I prioritize myself well-being. I always thought this should actually be the guiding, the headline indicator in some sense. And it has the environment, it has sustainability, ecological indicators. Gross national happiness in Bhutan. I know there's so much to say about that. It's not even an index of happiness and all sorts of things. I wanted to cite it here for one specific reason. It has, and I'm not sure many people are so aware of that, it has a specific sustainability component in that it says we're having all these different dimensions of well-being, and then we're defining sufficiency thresholds. So people are considered happy according to the Bhutanese concept if, for instance, they have more than 5 friends. It's not about having a maximum of friends, but it's going above a sustainability threshold, having enough of that, and then you count it as happiness. For me, that has some sort of the sufficiency notion, has some sort of sustainability connotation in it. Alternatively, if you want to think big, you could also link subjective well-being. This is now going beyond House Life. You could link that to the attainment of sustainability goals. So Jeffrey Sachs did that in the World Happiness Report 2016, and he basically took the SDG index. So that's how sustainable our development is. You probably know that index better than me. And he related that to subjective well-being notions and could show that there's a positive relation between sustainable development and the Cantrell ladder notion of well-being here in this case. From a research perspective, all these approaches are very interesting, but they need to have some sort of philosophical underpinning. They have to have some sort of justification for me. And the justifications to those approaches are as varied as the researchers are dealing with that. I've just plugged one. Francesco, this is not only due to the recency effect that you gave a presentation a month ago on that. I really love that, and I really like that, and I really think it's a strong proposal. It's a radical proposal, but you could, for instance, say with this happiness-based focus, you could argue we're reaching sustainability if we're. This is a sketch, and if you don't believe it's a good proposal, read the whole thing that Francesco is doing. I'm probably not doing it justice, but focus on social capital, going back to a neo-humanist view of the person, prioritizing our social connections, increasing, fostering trust in society. All that makes people happier. All that leads to people refocusing their lives away from rat race dynamics, positional treadmills. Happier people also do more for the environment. That was the, if I'm not mistaken, the connection. And in turn, they get more happy. It's a very complicated and it's a very radical proposal in that sense that we need to think about society and people in it differently. And similar justifications would underlie many of the other instances. I myself have worked on a similar radical, I call those my crazy papers, because they're thinking big, and there's lots of issues I have myself with these suggestions I come up with. I call that homophilics, trying to link my favorite novel Homo Faber and also this being an economist, and we're having this notion Homo economics. I think going away from Homo economics to the happy person, prioritizing not only egotistical but pro-social motivations leads to different model building, leads to different focus, and leads to different policy advice. The radicality of these proposals and the associated problems in making them plausible, I would need another lecture for that to actually go through. I just wanna name one guy, Peter Ulrich, economic ethicist, who expounded on this, how we need to change our society. And he did that, he's a German, he did that in a magisterial work of 1,000 pages book. So if you want to read that, bring some time. And this focus in saying we got to go away from having ever more, going to it is enough, or to a view of sufficiency, if you will, brought him somewhere around page 500, 600, to a radical criticism of capitalism and the market economy. Because the basic argument is a little bit like Michael Sandel's arguments. The basic argument is it might be nice to switch to that. But what if the market system, what if how we organize work, how we organize our lives is not neutral to that? Could say capitalism allows us to live any life we want to live. That's not actually true. If you're actually captured in those positional treadmill races, right? It might not be a good idea for yourself and your well-being to actually say, I'm getting out of that. I'm working less. I'm focusing more on social connections. I'm doing more for the environment. Because all your colleagues, they still work 70 hours a week. You get fired, and then where you're at. That's a caricature view of it, but I think it's a strong argument. Those social dilemma situations. How do we get to these radical rethinking? Let's think a little bit smaller, right? Second proposal category, using resources efficiently to attain well-being. That might be a different way of thinking about how can well-being research actually contribute to sustainability. And I mean, come on, what's not to like? Efficiency. If you're an economist like me, that's fantastic. Okay? Your heart opens up and you're like, okay, nobody can argue with efficiency. Okay, I'm not going so far in saying efficiency is not a value judgment, as some of my colleagues do. Of course it is a value judgment, but it's a very minimal one. Okay, given some other goals and limited resources, it makes sense to think about how do we spend those resources to gain the most bang for our buck. Huh? Can we use that in the arena of subjective well-being research and the environment? Yes, of course, and maybe you have heard from that. Happy Planet Index, it's been around since 2006. Yeah? Basically saying how much well-being do we get per pollution of the environment? How much well-being, it's a bit more complicated in terms of how much happy life years do we get in terms of that. But this is what those guys have been doing, and they're still doing it. It's gotten a little bit more silent around them, but this is from the 2019 version of the index. Going to look up Germany. I was going to look up Luxembourg. I thought bringing the slides for that up would be rude. So those are the winners. Costa Rica consistently on top of that. Okay. You can think of that more broadly. Efficiency. You can say you don't have to go with this, but you could say resource use per well-being. Again, this is coming from production theory. This is an economist again doing their economics thing. People are little production functions of well-being, and you put some resources into them and they get some well-being output. how do we make that efficient? You can choose your own concept of well-being, and you can think about which resources are you interested in. I know Milena Nikolova is doing research on that. I think Francesco and Kelsey are working on that. I think it's a very interesting way of also thinking about what we're having right now. Can we use it to get more well-being? The interesting thing, obviously, is not to create those little league tables. The interesting thing also for policy would be then to say, what are the resources? What are the factors that allow us to use our resources more efficiently? How do we actually get, given that we want to spend so much on our environmental resources, how do we get the most well-being out of it? What should we do? What are the institutions? Got to point back to your proposal. Likely one of the factors, if we're looking at that, might be social capital. If we're living in trustful societies, if we're living in societies with strong social ties, it might be easier for us to actually convert resources, income into well-being than if we're living in societies where that is not the case. Okay? I got to build my gated community home. I got to buy weapons to defend myself against other people. Probably don't have to do that there. So there might be a connection to your proposal in that sense here as well. Okay, final proposal. And that's, to me, that's the most modest, the double dividend. I want to focus on that. I'm a very modest person. I feel very bad by making these grand proposals. Let's look at that. Many times, if you look at the narratives for sustainability, you always get into this, we need to cut down, we need to do less. And again, from an economic point of view, utility ordinarily equivalent to income. That means if we're consuming less, our utility goes down. This is if you wish, the model relationship for that. Cutting down is unattractive for the individual. Now, here's where subjective well-being research comes in and says, no. Jackson coined the term of double dividend. Actual up-to-date paper, Herzig et al. The narrative or the idea is, if cutting down in the sense of doing pro-environmental behavior is positively associated with well-being, actually you have to say if it causes higher well-being, but get to that, then there is no sacrifice. You consume less, you do more good for the environment, and you're happier in the process. So it's not a sacrifice. It's a win-win situation. I've read a paper where there's a third win, so triple win. I don't recall which win was that. But here it's the individual who cuts down wins and the environment wins. Remember Zawadzki et al., the small to moderate effects of pro-environmental behavior on well-being. Similar arguments, altruism, pro-social behavior and well-being. The narrative is also attractive. The individual can do something. All the other things are big policy organizations, our governments, whatnot. Here we're talking about what can you do, what can I do? Mark, I don't know whether that in some sense satisfies you and your bottom-up perspective, but I think this goes much more strongly into that. I wouldn't know, I think if we know this is true, governments and organizations can inform citizens about them, right? But this is mostly for us. How are we doing with time? Do I have some more? Okay, so otherwise I would have said everything is fine, we got to go on. But as the picture suggests, I don't think everything is fine. I want to take the double dividend thing because it's the most modest and it's the, for me, it's in some sense the most concrete and the most easy to describe. And I want to pick a little bit at it because I want to, don't get me wrong, I do it from a loving perspective. I want this to be true. Okay, but in order to be convincing, we need to know, is this actually reliable? Can we actually count on that? And I've done quite a bit of research on that. And I have some lingering doubts. So that's the section what we don't know yet. How plausible is this double dividend? My fear is we need to address some challenges in order to make that plausible. I don't think we're there yet. I think we do have a bit of a problem. We're overselling this idea, or those people who do oversell the idea. And I apologize to all my referees out there who might, whenever I publish in environmental economics, I get these reports and they say, say more about the policy implications. We have to have stronger policy implications. You got to do more. My impression is, for me as a researcher, I don't think we're there yet to make these strong things. The elephant in the room is causality. That's for me, it's a huge issue. Not so much that I say correlational papers are crap. Correlational papers are fine. I think in many ways, we've chosen a topic of research, subjective well-being, where it's really, really tough to get at the heart of causality because it correlates with everything. It causes so many things and it is influenced by so many things. So that's strong causal identification is really, we should have chosen a different topic of research in some sense. But we need to try if we want to base policy on it. If we want to base policy on a correlational relationship, we need to be sure it's not a third factor actually causing this. Because then varying pro-environmental behavior will not get me subjective well-being if it's a third variable that actually influences both. So from the point of view of policy, I think we need to come to grips with, is pro-environmental behavior actually causing people to be happier? And if you're looking into this meta-analysis, and I'm not ribbing on the meta-analysis, I think it's great to have it, and it's huge progress to actually have a picture of where we stand. This is correlations. So we're having 78 studies showing that pro-environmental behavior and subjective well-being is associated. Half of those studies actually hypothesize a causal relationship from well-being to pro-environmental behavior. They're all in there. So if I use that for my narrative to say green behavior makes me happier, half of the studies in there are actually not about that. Causality, only 8 of those have quasi-experimental designs. That's why I'm a little bit unhappy with the study because it doesn't tell me which ones they are. They also explicitly write, many of those establish the relationship of causality from mood and affect to pro-environmental behavior. To me, that's a big red flag in the sense that, please, let us think about how can we come up with a credible identification to put a little bit more weight on that. There's one study where they're actually doing an experiment and they tell people tomorrow, go out, do something fun. Tomorrow, go out, do whatever you want to do. And tomorrow, go out and do 3 things for the environment. And then they ask about the subjective well-being. I think it's going into the direction where we want to go. Or, I don't know, find a good natural experiment. Introduction of the bag charge in the UK, something like that comes to mind. You're brilliant people. If you find something there, I think you really move the field forward. I haven't been successful in finding something. So I'm looking forward if you have ideas. Here's another big one. Measuring those pro-environmental behaviors. That's also something we're not, I think, spending enough time with. I know in well-being studies, we spend a lot of time with measuring subjective well-being, but the literature on pro-environmental behaviors, they mostly rely on self-reports of a highly divergent set of different pro-environmental behaviors. Yeah? Self-reports are driven, especially if norms are strong, and norms about pro-environmental behavior can be assumed to be strong. They might be driven by social desirability. And I'm not quoting studies. I think there's 5 studies doing that, and I don't think they're not doing a good job. I'm not good at putting the names out there, but you can read them in my papers. It's surprisingly few look into that at all. All the studies using this cite those few studies that are done nearly all on students, nearly all on self-reports, nearly all on, I correlate my green self-report with some sort of measurement scale for impression management. And then worst comes to worst, absence of a significant correlation is interpreted as there is no effect. Okay, so that's the holy trinity of what not to do in that sense, especially considering if you're looking at interaction terms. It's also one of my pet peeves. Requires huge power to actually detect interactions that are significant. So it's hard to if I'm not saying that as somebody is sympathetic to the field, but you want to convince your critics that there's no social desirability in that, right? And I don't think those studies will cut it. There's one study that actually looked at, they asked people and said, hey, tell me how much you're doing for the environment. And then tomorrow we're going to ask your parents how much you're really doing. And that led to those people actually saying, yeah, well, we're doing much less than they would have said otherwise in the control group. Okay, so I think there is some social desirability bias, but we don't really know about that. In general, we're mostly focusing in subjective well-being research in this double dividend literature on self-reports of pro-environmental behavior. But are they good, aside from social desirability, are they good proxies for behavior? Because I think that's what we're interested in. We're not interested in saying if we get people to say they do more green, they will be happier, but they are supposed to do more green. Meta-analysis by Cormos and Gifford, 2014, I think 15 studies went into that. They found a correlation of 0.46. Before we're saying, okay, all is fine, they themselves said, no, we might have a conventionally large correlation, but if we're looking at how much self-report predict behavior, so if we're looking at the R-square of that, we're finding that nearly 80% of the variance of observed behavior is not explained by self-reports. Don't get me wrong, most times when we're looking at causal impacts, R-squared does play no role. It doesn't matter for our usual regressions. But when your regression is, I want to know whether the behavior is predicted by the self-report, then R-squared is a meaningful statistic. And they conclude and say we have a conventionally large correlation, but the effect actually is functionally small. So much of what we see in variation in behavior is not actually usefully correlated with what people say. This one is also giving me sleepless nights and nightmares, because this is a fun paper where Galizia and Navarro Martinez in management science, they went to the lab. It's students again, but what can you do? They went to the lab and they had students actually self-report altruism on altruism scales. Then they had to have them play little dictator games and so on, and they correlated that. And self-reports of altruism, they correlate well with behavior in the lab. You might say, okay, that's a good sign in terms of, so we see there's some behavior and there's some self-report correlation. Now, the fun thing about that study, and I want to do something like that as soon as I figure out a great way to do it. Fun thing of that is, as soon as the students went out of the lab, they ran into some person saying, hey, can you help me bring those boxes into the cellar? Hey, I lost my smartphone. Can I make a call on yours? And guess what? This real behavior, if you will, outside of the lab correlates extremely poorly with any self-reports and with any lab behavior of those people. Okay, if we're interested in real world behavior, that made me really uncomfortable. Okay, because I say, okay, if we're having lab experiments, that's a good thing, and we can build on that. The lab field correlation in the literature review, they looked at 39 students, was 0.14. Less than 40% of those studies were significant. Their own experiment, which I reported on, the correlation between self-reports and real-life behavior, pro-social, not pro-environmental, but I think it has a bearing on what I'm saying about the pro-environmental area, is 0.03 and non-significant. I got curious after that study. I did my own experiment. It's fun to do these things. You can mess up a lot. But anyways, with Ann-Kathrin and a colleague from Bard College Berlin, we actually did a field study. Took 600 people coming to the municipal office in Göttingen. So those are some students, but those are regular people, right? People in the field. And we had them actually do a battery of self-reports for green behavior. But before we had them do that, we also said, hey, thank you for coming. Here's a couple of notepads and a couple of pens. Why don't you pick one if you want to take notes during the questionnaire? And we offered them choice of brown and recycled paper and recycled pens and normal stuff. And we recorded that and we looked at who's actually going, and I think it's okay. Sometimes we didn't actually lie, but we didn't tell them something, okay? Afterwards, we also gave them the choice to donate to green causes out of their own money. We did incentivize the questionnaire by letting them participate in a lottery, but we said the lottery vouchers, some people donated the lottery vouchers they got, but we didn't count them. We wanted to see, do they give their own money? Right? And we've seen, well, it's not as bad as in Galizzi, Navarro, Martinez, but it's also not as good as in Commerce, Gifford. And cream product choice correlates with self-reports, but the effect is much, much smaller than the 0.46. It's 0.09. Right? Donation, not even statistically significant. Okay, so the whole literature that goes on with the double dividend, green behavior, subjective well-being, is based on self-reports, but we're not sure what these self-reports actually measure. It doesn't seem to be a lot of actual behavior. Where's this coming from? This is another shot at this relationship, green behaviors and subjective well-being. The self-reported behavior is very, very widely. Waste behavior, travel choice, mobility, resource use, donations, political actions, all these are used in different studies in different ways and are correlated. And there's a huge difference between a measure that says, please rate on a scale from 1 to 5, how often you leave the tap water running while brushing your teeth, and the question, how many McMansions do you live in and how many SUVs are you driving? So the impact for the environment between the two is massive. Right? Same with using public transport, not eating meat, or cutting down on flights. Stern and Preisendorfer-Diekmann distinguished green behavior by intent-based and impact-based. Intent-based is I want to show off I'm green. Sure, I'm not leaving the water running, but don't ask me how I got to the conference, right? Because I'm not gonna sit 15 hours in a train if the plane goes 1.5 hours. I never pretended I'm green, but I mean, you get my point, right? Most people at some point have much, much less problem doing that than the other thing. And if leaving the tap water running is making you happy, but not the other one, because it's really an inconvenience, cutting down on your car use, cutting down on your flights, cutting down on your mobility, then the double dividend argument is not that strong anymore. Okay? Because we can get people happy to do some green things, but those green things do not have a meaningful impact on the environment. 70% of the impact of our behavior on the environment comes from the areas of mobility, housing, and nutrition. Those are the big ones. Not leaving your tap water running, not turning your TV on standby at night, or turning it off, stuff like that. Right? So if happiness comes from consciously turning off the light and feeling green without real green impact, I think this double dividend argument is dead in the water. And I'd like to see some research on that. That's a different view from my own research on that, getting to grips with that. This is UKHLS data. And we looked at green self-image and actual green behavior. And it's self-reported green behavior, but still, I think you can learn something from it. So we looked at people who rated themselves, I'm environmentally friendly in most or all things that I do. You could also say I'm not environmentally friendly, I do 1 or 2 environmentally friendly things, and so on. And we take that as a measure of green self-image. It's a summary measure of how green your lifestyle is, if you will. We looked at that, and then we said, okay, let's look at how people who rate themselves that way actually report what they're doing in terms of concrete green behaviors. Okay, and the percentages that are too small for you to read there are basically saying, if you're saying I have a very, very green identity, then you still have 22% of the people not turning off their TV at night. Then you still have 50% of the people not buying a product due to excessive packaging. So those are people who are saying, I'm very, very green, but they're in parts, it depends on the behavior. It massively depends on the behavior, not doing green things. 65% would not cut down on flights. Right? That's, I think I'm in that category. Hey, so the double dividend, I'm now getting to the end and putting these things together with what I said about identity. I think the double dividend hinges a lot on our subjective perceptions of the world. So it's sort of my plea or my hunch that when we're looking at what influences happiness, as economists, we're usually looking into a lot of objective things. I know environmental psychologists and many other fields also look at these subjective perceptions, but I think it's relevant to see it's both, it's objective and subjective perceptions. We know that pro-environmental behaviors are driven in part by objective things such as costs, but they're also driven by individual motivations, values such as altruism. They're driven by social norms, and they're driven by one's identity and one's worldview. That is uncontroversial. There's a huge literature on that. The thing is, if you want to do the double dividend argument, I think you need to actually look at that literature and ask yourselves, wouldn't the welfare gain from pro-environmental behavior not also depend on why I do stuff? If I do stuff and it's not in my mind green behavior, I take the bus because I can't afford an SUV. Am I green? I mean, as an environmentalist, for the environment, you can say, yeah, you're doing something good. But for the well-being gain, if you're not even aware of that, you're just, oh, I'm shitty poor. I don't think you for yourself, you realize that as I'm doing something great for the environment and you're happy about it. Similar, if you feel compelled by society to do that, if social norms are very strong, and you feel like you're doing that not on your own, but you're doing that to avoid the disapproval of your peers, of your friends, of your neighbors, is that gonna actually be positive for your subjective well-being? I think maybe not. I'm very careful here. I think this is the last slide, or the second to last slide. So if, I just want to, I did some work on that, and I'm not finished doing work on that. I'm not saying this is the most convincing work, but I think it points in exactly this direction that we need to ask this question if we want to make the double dividend argument work. I've done two things. One is a fun, crazy project with a Spanish student. The other one is I would consider a little bit more serious with the UK HLS data. Nevertheless, with the Spanish students, we looked at their well-being. We looked at self-reported pro-environmental behavior. And then some of you might know Mariano Rojas's conceptual reference theory about notions of the good life. How do you conceive of happiness? And we asked those students, what do you think is the good life? And we looked at how their perception of how they perceive the world, how they actually make sense of the world in terms of their well-being, how that affects the effect that pro-environmental behavior has on subjective well-being. The main effect is negative, okay? So Spanish students, the more green they are in their self-reports, the lower their subjective well-being. I had lots of helpful people from Spain tell me, well, Spanish students are just not concerned about the environment. I don't know, I just put that out there, maybe that's that. We've seen, however, that there's a moderator in the sense that if you subscribe to a Stoic worldview, then doing more for the environment leads to higher subjective well-being. So there is some sort of how you make sense of the green stuff you're doing. It impacts on how you experience your well-being gain resulting from that. It's a little bit surprising in the sense that you would say, if you're a Stoic, you would say, well, the world might be burning, but life goes on. No, it doesn't seem to be the case. Stoics aren't indifferent in that sense. Okay? It's a correlational study and its students, I know, but it's sort of, it goes into this, I think we should try and learn more about that. It's the negative coefficient gets even more negative if you're subscribing to a fulfillment view of the good life and a tranquility one. The tranquility one I can't make sense of. Fulfillment, I want to fulfill my capacities. I want to live the best life I can live. Doing green stuff means slowing down, maybe, and that's not what we're about. Pro-environmental behavior as a distraction, I don't know. Very explorative. Similar here, green self-image and subjective well-being in the UK. So this is general populist data. It's fixed effects regression, at least. I mean, still, I'm not making causal claims, but what I want to show is this: we're having a positive association between green self-image and subjective well-being measured as life satisfaction in the data. Okay, so not actual behavior, but my lifestyle is green. I am more satisfied with my life. And then we look at how does that actually change if we're taking into account societal norms. Okay, this is going back right to identity, conformity versus social distinction. If we're all conforming to this norm, does that make me happier? If more people are doing green stuff and I do green stuff, does that make me happier? Sad answer, no. Sad answer, it's the other way around. It doesn't seem to be conformity, it seems to be social distinction. We've done that on the level of government regions. We looked at how high the level of greenness as self-reported greenness is in different regions, the prevalence of greenness in their region, and that decreases subjective well-being. The more people who are doing green stuff in your region, the less you get a benefit from doing green stuff in terms of your subjective well-being. Okay? Because everybody's doing it, it's no longer special. You can't actually distinguish yourself for being a green person. I don't know, maybe it's you look down on others and you say, I'm so green, you're not, and that makes you happy. Same for increases in fractionalization. Same in terms of the narrative, but the effect is positive here. The more fractionalized the green attitudes in your region are, i.e. the more diversity you're having there, okay? Rao's entropy, 1 minus the Herfindahl index. It's like a Gini measure of diversity, what we've been using here. The more fractionalized that is, the higher well-being gain. Again, it's pointing in the direction, the more different attitudes you have, the more you can actually distinguish yourself by being green. The less conformity pressure you have, the more positive for your well-being. And this last one, polarization, Esteban Rao measure, weighted diversity measure. So the bigger the groups, the more polarized society is in terms of green attitudes. That's really annoying. Because if society is really polarized on the green issue, there are two types of people, or two groups of people who gain big well-being benefits. Those are the green ones, and those are the extremely ungreen ones, the really brown ones. Right? So if you're not believing in climate change at all, if you don't care about that at all, you get distinction utility in a society that's highly polarized through this social norm channel. It comes on top of the little green benefit you get for your own social motivation, but it counteracts that. The social norm channel is much, much stronger. Okay? And I'm saying it worries me because we're seeing a little bit of that in Germany right now. We're having this Green Party is in power, and they started to really institute green policies, and some of them hurt. Okay, we need to exchange our radiators in homes towards more environmentally friendly things, and that can be really, really expensive. And climate denier parties or right-wing parties are jumping on a huge dissatisfaction in the German populace with these green measures, where non-negligible, a large part of the Germans shows what I would call a little bit like reactance. Okay, somebody starts and talks to you very ideologically, the Green Party, and saying you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, and people say, well, who are you to tell me that? Okay, and that leads to polarization, and that leads to this whole narrative of the double dividend. Somehow it's, yeah, you get a dividend also from being brown. I don't think that's a good finding. That's why I say it worries me from the point of view. I think we need more research on that. I think we need to have stronger designs on that. UKHLS, I love that data set to death. But the green stuff they're asking every 4 years apart. They're very inconsistent about what they're doing. They're in the process of revamping that. It's not the best data set to look at that. I think a lot can be learned looking at other data sets, thinking about that. Okay, that's pretty much it. I think there are interesting contributions to be made from the area of subjective well-being studies in terms of how do we further sustainability, how do we get to sustainable development. To me as a researcher, and this is a little bit chiming with discussions we had yesterday, and Carrie and I talked about that on the way to dinner as well. As a research scientist or as an academic, to me, I see a little bit of a danger, or I read the literature, specifically the double dividend literature, in a way that this is a highly politicized literature. Lots of good people in there, lots of people with good intentions in there, but making very, very strong policy claims based on data and on our knowledge that we're having that I don't think stands up so much to scrutiny. I think those proposals would be much more convincing. And I think more politicians might actually also be convinced of that, or policymakers or the general public might be convinced of that if we're basing that on more solid knowledge. I think this is a huge opportunity for all you brilliant people out there to actually go into that field and look, what can we do? So I think going beyond this, these are the determinants of happiness. Doing more careful research in terms of dealing with those issues of heterogeneity, dealing of those issues, perception of the world, and so on, there's a massive contribution still to be made. And I think we're, as subjective well-being research, as a field, I think we're getting into this phase where we can mature, where we are maturing in the sense of going from 10 years ago, it was a minor miracle if you got your well-being research published in a good academic journal. That has massively changed. But I think at least in the field I've just talked about, we should aim at trying to get some things sorted and be a bit stricter about that. So not a negative conclusion, but more like I think we can do this, and I think it's time, and I think it's useful for society. So we should think about that. Thank you very much.
I open the Q&A part of this talk. Harry and then Sophia. Stefano.
Thanks very much. This was fascinating and quite disturbing at the same time. One thought, I wonder if we're going at this slightly the wrong way around, in the sense that what we're focusing on here is the benefits of action. And there are some enormous costs of inaction, probably to people's subjective well-being, that will make a much more powerful case for action. So I'm thinking, the subjective well-being cost of being displaced because of rising sea levels or natural disasters, the subjective well-being costs of extreme heat in urban areas, these sorts of things. I mean, just from a global policy perspective, and I know you opened with a couple of examples, but a lot of those examples are very short term, rather than large aggregate studies saying, okay, well, if we're expecting this many million people to be displaced as a result of climate change by 2060, what does that mean globally? So rather than looking at the very short term, we did a study in this one city where this thing happened, actually trying to aggregate this up, I think it would tell possibly a more powerful story than going at it at this very sort of positive benefits of action.
Shall I respond directly, or? Yeah, I agree on some level. I think in terms of incentives, there's this idea that if you have a stick or if you have a carrot, you prefer the carrot because people would actually respond better to that. I hesitate to quote Stalin on this, because I think so much million people being displaced and sea level rising, that's a statistic for most people. I don't think how much that actually. I think this is a little bit this is armchair empiricism, but I think it's plausible if you're looking at this huge train wreck. We're going to be like an animal who's learned helplessness. We get out of that and we're just doing nothing. So I think this. I totally agree. The negative sides are obviously this is the thing, but how do you translate that into concrete action for individuals? I think they're the positive, the motivating side. You can do something. This is why I said the double dividend is the one that I see also as, in some sense, most democratically, potentially legitimized, in a sense that we can go and say, look, we're doing this together. It's not some government that some people are distrustful of, but everybody, we're packing it together and then we're doing something. The short-term and long-term consequences, that's another issue I didn't even go into, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the long-term consequences, you need to aggregate that over time. And I haven't, for any of the results, this is another big gap in the literature, and it goes a little bit to what Caspar has been doing yesterday, and what large parts of social choice literature have been doing for quite a while. Actually, think back what Danny Kahneman said. We actually should look, when it comes to well-being, at the integral under the curve. So the coefficient is a point in time, and nothing in the literature tells us something how sustainable or how long are those effects. The effect sizes anyways are quite small in many of those studies. Okay, this is not a huge well-being boost you're getting from this behavior, right? But you would have to look at how does it develop over time? Will it go away? I think some of that might also be the novelty value. Think back of the study I mentioned about the experiment. Experimenter tells me do something green tomorrow. Obviously, I'm primed, and maybe I never did something green before, so I'm doing that, and I'm really focused, and it's salient for me. I don't know if your green behavior is extremely habitual, turning off the lights all the time. I can't imagine that's a big well-being boost I'm getting out of that, right? And over time, it starts to get stale. We don't know what's happening. Okay, we don't have the research. This is what I'm saying. Actually, a lot of research is missing here.
Thank you for the presentation. My question maybe gets at the causality question. So you mentioned at the top of the presentation that there were a lot of findings that pro-environmental behaviors leads to greater subjective well-being. But then you followed this up with a study that found that this was mostly an effect from the purchasing behavior, which makes me think that it might not be happier individuals that participate or do more pro-environmental behaviors, but it's richer individuals. So how does the idea or the proposal for sustainability as a pathway to happiness apply for low-income individuals or low or middle-income countries?
That's a really good question, and this is going exactly into this heterogeneity of the green behavior stuff, because what we're seeing is this. Let me start with the richer countries, in the sense that I did analysis on the UKHLS data. And the UKHLS data has 11 green behaviors. Some of that are this: I'm switching my TV off, I'm leaving the water running. And then there's 4 big ones: mobility, fewer flights, I'm walking a lot, I'm using car share, and there's another one. And what you see is, if you're looking at the correlations between income and green behavior, the higher the income, the less green the behavior. Okay, so you have rich people doing extremely non-green stuff in some areas, and they're doing they could be doing, as you suggest, green stuff in other areas when they buy green things. So you could actually, I don't know, this might be interesting to look at. You could actually have a situation that if you have a lot of money, you get a high well-being payoff from your green purchase behavior, while at the same time massively polluting the environment, because you're having these 3 big cars and this huge heated swimming pool and whatnot. In that sense, I'm not aware that I'm sure there are some studies who look at lower income countries. One of the hunches I have about that is, if you go back to the Happy Planet Index, why is Costa Rica always consistently on 1? Why are many other countries consistently on lower places? It's not so much the happiness part, it's more the ecological footprint part. So if you're a poor country, you're in many ways, you're set to not pollute the planet in many ways, right? But this is heterogeneity that is ill captured there, and it's not discussed in the double dividend literature.
Okay, maybe there is another problem with this double dividend idea. I read there are several studies on the impact on climate change of pro-environmental consumption behavior. The last one I read is significantly titled "Good Intentions, Bad Results." All these studies say the same thing. These individual behaviors have no impact. And even people with pro-environmental behavior pollute more than the average, because the main determinant of pollution is income. And pro-environmental behavior tend to spread more within high-income people. The message of all these studies is that we live in a very energy-intensive system. That the change we have to do is collective, it's not individual. Do you think that if these people doing pro-environmental behavior knew this, they still would be happier, assuming that they are happier?
Okay, good question. Based on the research I've done on this discrepancy between like green self-image and green behaviors, I think in some way, if you can convince yourself that you're actually green, you ignore that knowledge. Right? So you could, and then you reap that happiness benefit. This is why I'm saying it's, in some sense, you could think of that as green hypocrisy. And in some sense, this is also what I'm saying about the symbolic behavior. If you're having green symbolic behavior, saying, okay, I'm turning off the tap while brushing my teeth, we're not doing anything meaningful for the environment. As you say, impact-based green behavior, the real pollution increases with the income. Right, and that's why I'm saying this is something. If we see that cutting down on that, on those behaviors, so fewer flights, smaller house, less heating, these no longer eating meat. I'm not going to ask who of you went for the vegetarian option yesterday. If we did that, and that would give us happiness benefits, then the double dividend argument would work. But I don't know. We don't know. I think we should try and find out if we want to push this argument. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. And I promised you one question, so here it comes. No, actually, I have a very practical question. So
I thought I fed you the question to ask me yesterday.
True. So here it comes.
Go ahead.
So you know that we agree on causality, measurement, effect size. That's completely on board with you. Practical question for us, which data set would you recommend us to use? Because you mentioned UKHLS, but what about SOEP, HILDA? Like, do we have enough information to really address this kind of question?
I think I said it in terms of the UKHLS data set that I was a little bit disappointed in the sense that they had some questions in there, but they're not asking them consistently. Though if you space that 4 years apart, that's as good as not having a panel data set in some sense, right? Variation over 4 years. So they have. The thing is this, and I'm sorry if that sounds so critical. I think do we have a systematic way of thinking of that? We're still in part struggling with what sort of green behaviors should we measure? What should we look at? SUB has stuff about electricity, energy use. That's good. I think we can do a lot with this. UKHLS data, we can also do a lot of it. I think it depends a little bit what you want to do. What I'm thinking of in terms of if we had a little bit more experimental evidence where we had people do that stuff, well-powered experiments, different behaviors, just Galizzi, Martinez Navarro study, something like that, right? I think that would go a long way in this area. Where do we get the causal effect with all the problems that experimental studies have and all the validity concerns and so on, but we don't have enough of those. Natural experiments also. I think if we're cleverly trying to think about something like that. I know there's one study doing pre-post comparison of this change in the charge for the bag in Wales and UK because it was introduced at staggered times. Stuff like that. I think the data should be out there, but I couldn't say there's one of these best practice things. Right, I went and got some data in a German medium-sized town because I thought I want to see how real people act, and that's another aside on one of those self-image measures that's used widely through the literature, and we're using them also because it's the one study that we have. But we went to normal people, we asked them this question, and our research assistant got feedback from not few people saying, "I don't understand the question you're asking me here." Okay, so in terms of this is measurement again. I get it that it's cheap to use students and it's okay to use students on many things, but it's sort of, I think there's a lot to do. And I can't help but smile because I think that's great because that means we can write papers about it. So I don't see that as a negative thing. I want to stress, I don't want to be seen as criticizing that, but it pays to really think about it. And this is what I meant with the politicization of these research questions. There's always, in my mind, a little bit this danger of complacency that we're saying it fits with our prejudices. It would be cool if that worked. And then we're just saying, okay, we're doing it in the way that everybody else does. Right? And this is also to your question in terms of if rich people are much more polluting the country. That's a message that we don't like to hear. And that will have consequences on what research we can do if this is a highly politicized research question, right? Can you publish that? Can you publish a paper in a field where everybody says, yes, the double dividend should work? And you're the person to cast doubt on that because you did a well-measured, controlled experiment on that. sorry, I can't be more concrete on that. There's so much great data out there, but it really depends a little bit on your question.
Hey, Martin. So I really appreciate this. I think it's very sobering, but only if you're asking for the double dividend, perhaps. So maybe we're asking too much. You know, it doesn't have a cost to current well-being, if I understood everything that you presented. So, but it does seem to have a benefit, although maybe the individual behavior doesn't have much of an impact, but it does have a benefit on future well-being. Are we asking too much?
I mean, that's a great idea and a great question to say maybe we shouldn't actually worry about the current well-being, but focus on the future well-being. But that's, I mean, in some sense, that's what the standard narrative is anyways, right? What we're doing for the environment today is not for our well-being, it's for the future well-being we need to cut down. And you see how well that works, because we all love cutting down so much, right? So in that sense, the double dividend has for me this promise that if it were to work, if it worked, we could get people to come on board much more enthusiastically in doing these things if they realize it's not a sacrifice. And in that sense, yes, of course, it might need to be a sacrifice, and I think we're all in agreement on that. But just looking at the political process in Germany right now, where we're seeing some real sacrifices need to be made. And then large parts of the population, perhaps rightfully so, especially if they're low-income parts, are saying, how can you actually tax us with so high costs at such an inopportune moment? Right? So from that point of view, I think we need to think more about future generations. All of us agree. But at the point where it actually starts to cost us, that's the thing. It costs you money, it costs you effort. So in that sense, even if it doesn't cost you any well-being, and I'm not sure, because some of those polarization issues, the more people are doing it, the more the minimal own benefit you get is compensated by the negative effect from everybody else who's doing that. Thank you very much.